بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. صباح الخير على الجميع. I would like first to welcome you all, ladies and gentlemen, in Rasanah, the International Institute for Iranian Studies. I thank you all, speakers, session moderators, and participants for accepting our invitation and attending this important workshop. Since the revolution in 1979, there has been no official diplomatic ties between United States of America and Iran. Yet the unofficial relation has its own ups and downs. The new administrations in DC dealt with Iran in a completely different way compared to previous administration. We are talking about Obama era. Trump decided to withdraw from the nuclear deal, P5+1, and enforce the lifted sanctions. Furthermore, 2 weeks ago, the American administration enforced the second phase of the sanctions against Iran. We are talking about the American sanctions against Iran that were left in 2015. On the other side, the Iranian regime has kept its policy toward the region without any changes in its behavior, threatening the region and raising the idea of stopping regional oil export from the Strait of Hormuz. Whether it is possible for Iran or not, the threat should be taken seriously, especially when it comes to the IRGC or the Revolutionary Guard. The other important issue that we will discuss today in this workshop is the implication of the developments of the American-Iranian relationships in the region general and the GCC in particular. Here we will look forward to hearing from ideas from both scenarios. I mean, one is the continuity of the tension in the relation between Iran and the United States, and the other, if there is any improvement in the relation or any deal will be reached between the two sides. I will stop here and I will ask Dr. Ambassador Abdurrahman to start the first session. Thank you very, very much again for attending this important workshop. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. Alhamdulillah wahdahu wassalatu wassalam ala man la nabiyya ba'dah. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am delighted to be here today in this discussion in Rasanah Institute. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Muhammad Salami for his kind invitation to be with this illustrious gathering and with this distinguished speaker and guests. Thank you very much, Dr. Muhammad.
Thank you.
As you know, the subject of today is the US-Iran relations, from accommodation to confrontation. So as also the world has witnessed tremendous changes since the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran. Those changes has caused many tension in the Middle East in general and in the Gulf area in particular. When looking at the Iranian leadership, there are many key issues that cause tension in the region, especially with the Arab states. The first, there are the ambition to acquire nuclear weapons. The second is the occupation of the island of United Arab Emirates. The third is the persistent in the meddling in the affairs of the Arab nations or states, and their ambition, also their support of terrorism. Also, the 1979 revolution transformed Iran from a pillar of US strategy into one of the leading threat of the regional status quo and international system. Historically speaking, United States had a treaty called Eminent Treaty with the Iranian government in 1955. This treaty still exists until it was abrogated by Secretary of State last month, Mark Pompeo, because Iranian government used this amity treaty against American sanctions in the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Also, the Iranian has many questions about the US roles during the Mossadegh era, when the CIA orchestrated the overthrow of Mossadegh. It was in 1953. United States has also connection with the Iranian through encouraging them to be part of the Sintu agreement, which is called Baghdad Pact in 1955. Now we are in the state that President Trump, as Dr. Muhammad said, withdraw from the nuclear treaty, which is called JCPOA agreement, in May 8, and impose further sanction in November 4th, despite the objection of many members of the parties like UK, France, Germany, China, Russia, who say Iran is complying with its term. USA strategy has many problems also with the Iranian government foreign policy, especially regarding, for example, support of terrorism, opposition to the Middle East process, developing nuclear and mass destruction, also intercontinental missiles, production of the missiles. Having all of this, many people say that United States, regardless of its sanction and pressure, are still seeking to reach rapprochement with Iran. And this what we will find out from our discussion today, from those distinguished speakers. We have today Banafsheh, who are originally Iranian scholars, and she's now visiting scholar in Princeton University and non-resident fellow at the International Institute of Iranian Studies, Rasanah also. And she has many publications with the last one was book about Saudi-Iranian relations. She also has connection with the King Faisal Islamic Center and has participated in many times in their discussions. We have also one of the most important scholars in the Iranian and who has very unbounded intellect and very vast knowledge of international world affairs, Mr. Norman Roule, former National Intelligence Manager of Iran and senior advisor. He was also part of the companies for many years. And he is also a member of the Arabian Foundation Advisory Board. So we start today. We'll begin with we also have, yes, because he was not here present. Yeah. Sorry, I neglect. Also, I would like to welcome with us through via satellite Mr. Michael Singh. He's a Lane-Swig Senior Fellow and Managing Director at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Welcome, sir, also from distance. And we'll start with Professor Banafsheh, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you all for joining us today, and I want to especially thank Dr. Mohammed Al-Sulami and Rasanah for hosting this event and for having me here in Saudi Arabia, a country I adore, I love, despite my Iranian origins, or perhaps because of it. I just flew in yesterday, and driving through Riyadh, I determined that I actually like Riyadh more than Tehran now. And though Tehran is also a very beautiful city these days, I don't know how many of you have been there recently. But there's something about here that's very heartfelt for me. I want to start by addressing the title of the first session that we have, which really delves into whether the U.S.-Iran relations is about accommodation or rather confrontation. I'm not certain that it's either any longer. And we can debate that. But as I was thinking about what to say today, it occurred to me that perhaps we're looking at US-Iran relations as at a new stage in which we are required to develop a process of informed strategy choices towards Iran to allow us to be maneuverable about our choices, about what we do. I think there has been a certain level of stagnancy, and my colleagues here can debate that with me, in US-Iran relations for much too long, and we have not yet been able to take the leap forward and decide what to do next. So why is it that I say what I just said? I think that there's really no neat way in which we can define US relations towards Iran. It's really hard to do that. We can take a look at various models that we may have consciously or unconsciously applied to the understanding of Iran. And when I say we, I'm talking about the United States. I'm not personally a big fan of modeling human behavior and foreign policy or applying, mathematical models. But the United States has in the past tended to apply these mathematical models to predict behavior by its adversaries. And here I'm talking about two specific models: game theory and chaos theory. Again, I want to stress that it's uncertain if we even subconsciously think about the application of any of these theories to predict Iranian behavior. But let's, for argument's sake, assume that there's a little bit of game theory, chaos theory going on in our efforts to understand Iran better. Under game theory, the assumption is that if we have a series of sanctions, then that will trigger a pattern of behavioral change in Iran. We saw that happen under the Obama administration. Under the Trump administration, we have again enforced a series of sanctions to trigger that behavioral change. But one thing that I'm not certain how often we think about is that essentially our threat perceptions of Iran were different under the Obama administration versus the Trump administration. So just at the start, looking at the challenge of Iran, we have a loophole in how the United States chooses to look at Iran. And that loophole is that our assumptions from administration to the next, from one to the next, shift about Iran. But we still maintain a blanket policy of sanctions towards Iran. Fair enough. But what does that loophole mean? I've had the opportunity to speak with Iranians lately, and also I live in the United States and have had, an opportunity to see firsthand what the U.S. currently is thinking about Iran. And I'd like to, if you allow me, share a little bit of the narratives that have emerged. On the Iranian side, what they are saying is that the assumption that sanctions will trigger behavioral change is not a valid one. There's no need for us to shift our behavior towards an actor, i.e. the United States, that shifts its policies towards Iran every now and then. And we've heard Iran say that, and we kind of know. Actually, a lot of everything I say has been said already. I'm just trying to really frame it to see if we can develop a new model of looking at US-Iran relations. And when you look at the United States, I've mentioned that the loophole is in the perceptions that vary about Iran from one administration to the next. And essentially what we have are two governments that think behind closed doors with a series of assumptions and perceptions that may or may not exactly apply. So if game theory isn't exactly how we can characterize the US model of Iran's behavior, or something along those lines, the idea that more sanctions will bring about change of behavior, then could it be that we're looking actually not at such a clear pattern of behavior with Iran, but at a chaotic pattern of behavior with Iran? And can we model this pattern under chaos theory? Again, another mathematical theory which political scientists try to apply to their understanding of the behavior of their adversaries at times, for example, in this case, Iran. So under chaos theory, what we try to do is look at where Iran is most sensitive and target that point in order to trigger change. So we know that Iran is sensitive in its energy policies. It needs to export oil and gas in order to acquire money and revenues to run the country. We also know that a second extremely sensitive spot for Iran at the moment is its domestic problems. The rise of domestic protests and dissent is very problematic. So we try to pressure both. On one hand, we say, well, maybe there will be regime change, and there are many who harbor that idea that it will come about. And we also try to sanction Iran's energy markets. But in both cases, we haven't fully succeeded. In the energy markets, Iran has access to black markets. Iran has access to special arrangements. And though we can tighten the loop around Iran's neck on the energy front, we really don't know, how, if it can be done completely at all times. On the issue of domestic dissent, if you go to Iran, you realize that main urban areas are still pretty tranquil, are still quite peaceful. The dissent comes more from the non-large urban areas. Within the urban areas, if you speak especially to the Iranian middle class, they have no desire to get out there, put their necks out there for a change of regime and sacrifice, their own well-being, because life is hard enough in Iran. And again, for those of you who remember history, I grew up after the revolution. We went through a revolution, then the Iran-Iraq war. It was hard. So nobody really wants to do much over there unless the impoverished people kind of do something with the protests. So there we have loopholes within chaos, which means that we can expect to have more chaos if we look at the challenge of Iran through chaos theory. It might also hamper maneuverability. On the US side, and my colleague can speak better for that, I have a sense that the United States is not as flexible as Iran in shifting strategies and its maneuverability. The Iranians are the ones who actually strive on chaos far better. because they have experienced chaos since the revolution. So they have a lot more, they have ways of being maneuverable, and they are willing to pay prices that in the United States, people are less hesitant to do so. So having said that, Iran, again, thinks that it will outlast any US policy that attempts to put pressure on it, either on the energy front or on the local dissent front, because what the bottom line of those policies is that it strives on chaos, and they think they're adept at handling chaos. Okay. The other problem that we have in any modeling of US-Iran relations is that we start with a series of presumptions of rationality in Iran's behavior. But as Americans, we seldom, and I only speak from my experience, take a step back and say that what is rational to America may not be rational to Iran, and vice versa. We kind of know it, but we don't really think very deeply about it. So again, we have a problem, a loophole again, with the question of what kind of a rational actor Iran actually is. It is rational, but maybe not in the way that we think of it. And as long as we don't put ourselves in Iran's shoes, we cannot predict fully what rational choices or what irrational choices it might take in the future. A second problem with any modeling of US-Iran relations, again in Washington, is that we tend to look at Iran as a system. Tehran loves that. They call themselves the system of the Islamic Republic, Nizam. But the fact is that Iran is a broken system at the moment, and we know that as well. But our policies are not geared to addressing Iran fully as either a full system or a broken system. We're not certain at any given point of time what it is, and therefore we have more loopholes in US handling of the Iran challenge. So we might end up with a great deal of more irrationality on both the US side and on the Iranian side, especially if you sit across the table with both of them. Neither of them can fully articulate what the other one is saying. Just ask them. Ask the Trump administration, what is Iran saying? And they won't be able to articulate it properly. Ask the Iranians. I've sat with them. What is the US saying? Even in the most sophisticated groups of the Iranian revolutionaries, they cannot fully articulate what the United States is saying. And so they make it easy for themselves. In the United States, we know that Iran is black or white. It's evil or probably not good. In Iran, they say, you know, who cares what the United States thinks about Iran? They want regime change, period. And what happens is that on both sides, they fail, again, to navigate the nuances within the black and white, the nuances within, saying regime change and nothing else. Before regime change, there is a whole series of other things that Iran can maneuver with the United States and the reverse. And we haven't done enough thinking on those fronts. So this impacts our assumptions. In Iran, again, it's regime change or nothing. And they start making policies to prepare for that, and that's dangerous. In the United States, we say, well, we'll pressure Iran, and then we'll talk. But talk to who? We were just speaking this morning. Talk to Ayatollah Khamenei, talk to Foreign Minister Zarif, talk to Hassan Rouhani, or by the way, he's leaving office, talk to the next president. So let's get excited about what the next president in Iran will offer. And we forget that for 40 years, we've been exciting ourselves about the next president in Iran, and nothing has changed in the US-Iran relations. And I think that we fall in this trap of leadership changing things for us, but we're really systemically dealing with a very loopholed situation in the better understanding of US-Iran relations. So we end up in a circle that we've been going around in the past 40 years and getting nowhere. Now, meanwhile, we understand that sanctions is not a policy. Sanctions is not a substitute even for a policy. Sanction, in my humble opinion, is a lack of policy. It's a tool, it's a policy tool, but we mustn't confuse ourselves to ever thinking that it amounts to having a policy towards Iran, and we haven't had a policy towards Iran. And as long as sanctions remains the key tool in approaching to Iran, then the US will not have a policy towards Iran that is more comprehensive. And that is why every now and then, just recently, the Iranians and the Americans are thinking about, well, how about, I mean, I know that on the Iranian side, they don't trust talking with Washington, but they're like, maybe some level of faith-based talks might be a beginning, because Ayatollah Khamenei in Tehran sits there and understands that things are looking pretty bad and they have to do something. But on the U.S. side, on the Iranian side, they also hope, to buy time until President Trump leaves office and things change. But then again, no real policy, neither faith-based talks nor buying time is really a foreign policy that is solid. So my fear is that if and when the U.S. and Iran even sit at the table to talk, they still might not have no policy to talk about. I believe that even after the nuclear deal under President Obama was concluded, we did see a little bit of that. Despite the nuclear deal, pretty much most groups in America were unwilling to go to Iran and invest, because that speaks of uncertainty about what the real policy is. We had a nuclear deal. And you go around the world, except for a few Chinese and European companies, there's that hesitancy about how to approach Iran. Now, here's the real problem for countries like Saudi Arabia, and for the United States and everybody else. Sanctions, we don't know when and what kind of change of behavior it will bring about because of these many loopholes. And it might not be the change that we like. It might not even be the change that Tehran hopes to bring about. It's chaotic. So we can expect vastly different results from the sanctions. But meanwhile, the real problem for anyone who knows Iran and who studies Iran is that Tehran is continuing to climb the ladder. Tehran is continuing to influence Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, where not. Now, it might do it in a different way. It might use the buying of time with the Trump administration to build leverage. It might build leverage through confusion. It's very good at that. It might pressure people in Iraq and elsewhere. But one thing is certain, nothing will stop Iran from climbing the ladder in whatever way that it feels will give it leverage. While in the United States, we're just like, well, looking at a bunch of loopholes that we don't know how to exactly address. And this will complicate and confuse behavior. So in the end, I tried really hard to think, where does this take us? And I think that the best, we do need a policy, but since the United States has been handicapped in developing this policy towards Iran, we need a far broader based policy. I think the United States has to be humble in approaching the challenge of Iran and really invite, for example, its Arab allies, not just through words, but genuinely, to any serious discussion to be had about Iran. And also the Europeans, the Chinese, the Russians. A little bit of that has happened in Syria with Russia and Turkey. But I think that no one alone can fill these loopholes. If we do not make this a broad-based approach to Iran, we will lack the maneuverability we need to keep up with the Iranians while they're climbing those little ladders all over. And we will lack preponderant power over Iran. We lose to Iran, not fully. I mean, Iran is the big loser in my opinion here. But you know what I mean in terms of maneuverability in chaotic places in Iraq, Yemen, and this will pose a much longer term threat. So our real challenge is to develop a policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Banafsheh. Now I think we agreed with Dr. Muhammad. We'll go
Again?
agree.
Again? Once, only once. Okay.
We agreed with Dr. Muhammad that he will speak first, then we'll ask question later. So now we will turn to one of the most scholars and experts in this area, Mr. Norman. As he said, he wants me to call me Norman, not Mr. Roule. And please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gdaia. I'd like to thank my dear friend Mohammed for inviting me to this event with such esteemed colleagues. The Rasanah Institute has an exceptional and growing international reputation as one of the most important and insightful voices on the Iranian issue out there, and it's a pleasure to be part of this discussion, if only to associate myself with an institute of such significance. It's also a pleasure to be back in the kingdom, which is seeing so many important changes under the leadership of the king and the crown prince, and it's such a pleasure to see all of that. Iran is an issue that I've been working or associated with probably since about 1987, 1986. And since that time, there are strategically what seem to be a number of constants, frictions. Iran is a source of terrorism. Iran is a source of regional instability, of a nuclear program. The United States with a source of confrontation. But behind the scenes, and I've watched probably a few thousand hours of National Security Council and congressional meetings that take place, there is a significant understanding of the nuances and the various ramifications that policies can take. If you look at how U.S. interaction with Iran has been undertaken over the years, there have been multiple attempts by the United States to conduct outreach to Iran. These have been official, they have been unofficial. There have been extensive and periodic faith-based outreach through individuals in the United States, in part sometimes to engage the Iranians on discussions of U.S. detainees. There have been multiple discussions between Iranian academics and U.S. academics and officials over the years, and former U.S. officials over the years. And there have been periodic attempts by other governments to engage and to act as intermediaries between the United States and Iran, in essence, to bring these two crazy kids together, as I sometimes put it. The United States has tried different approaches to the Iranian problem. The problem has been defined by, frankly, Iranian aggression. It's difficult to develop a policy of accommodation or approach and then to have personnel killed or terrorism operations undertaken. You simply can't ignore in a year of policy to say we will have a policy of accommodation or diplomatic approach, and then to have detainees taken, Americans either killed, or failures of Iranian terrorist operations take place. Those actions by Iran tend to jerk policy making in the United States and make it very complicated, as voices on each side of the table of accommodation or confrontation will say, how do you accommodate a government which has killed 500 so many Americans in Iraq and wounded thousands of more? There's a fiction, and I'd like to unpack this, and I mentioned this in a different group yesterday, that the American-led invasion of Iraq brought Iran into the region. And this is commonly seen. That is wrong. That is as if saying that the Allied defeat of Nazi Germany in the Second World War brought the Soviet Union into Poland. As if the Allied defeat of Japan in the Second World War brought communism into North Korea. You don't hear those connections, but you hear this now. What has happened with the international community on Iran is that as Iran reached out into these unstable areas, there has actually been no cohesive international approach of red lines to the Iranians. Iranians can kill 500 Americans, what was the consequence? Khobar, what was the consequence? Beirut, cyber attacks against the United States for 176 days, the attack on the Saudi Foreign Ministry, the attack on Aramco. So if you're a policymaker in Washington or in Europe or anywhere else, sitting in a room saying, what do we do the next 6 months? It's difficult to develop a policy when every 6 weeks you have a very real and profound attack against your national interest. Now, putting this on the other side, you will have the offer of engagement by various Iranians. And it sometimes seems there are two Irans. And America is blessed with a large and highly valuable Persian American community. We have a representative here today. We're very fortunate to have that. And it's very easy to meet Iranians who say we want peace. But it's also a hard reality that there are millions of Iranians who voted for Ebrahim Raisi, the hardline candidate for Iran's presidential election, that the IRGC, which has conscripts, has thousands of loyal members, that the Quds Force has repeatedly rejected offers to interact with the United States. There was a public alleged approach by the previous director of the Central Intelligence Agency to tell the Iranians to, in essence, stop attacking Americans, and Qasem Soleimani famously refused to open the letter. That is not the first time that has happened. Much of this takes place behind the scenes, which is not fair in some case to the outside world because it provokes an idea of caricatures, that the US is maybe less willing to look at nuances, that the Iranians are a monolith, neither of which, of course, is true. But I must say that when it comes to red lines in the West, we really don't seem to have any with Iran. And I think this may have done all of us, to include the Iranians, a disservice. In the last year, there have been 5, and if you count the United States, 6 compromised terrorist attempts in Europe and the United States. What was the consequence to Iran? So if I were to ask any of you in this room, if you are the head of Iran's intelligence services, and you have said that in the last year you have sent 5 sets of operatives to blow people up and kill them in Europe at a time when Iran is attempting to maintain Europe as an ally on the nuclear deal without any consequence, can you think of a reason not to try one more time or 2 more times? But if you're in Washington, or if you are some of the parties who are threatened by potential death of your nationals, it's difficult to say this is a time to accommodate. In fact, it's an easy time to say, why doesn't Europe get this? Why doesn't Federica Mogherini ever mention anything about Iranian terrorism? Ever mention anything about Iranian missiles, not just fired against Riyadh, but fired against everyone who lives in Riyadh? We are all Saudis when it comes to Iranian Lebanese missiles fired from Yemen to this city. Subhanallah, if a missile is fired right now, it's not going to choose the Saudi nationals in this room when it strikes. And as one of the bigger targets, I think I'll go out first. So Americans, there are thousands of Americans and Europeans and Asians and other nationals in this country right now who are under threat from Iranian and Lebanese missiles. But this is not perceived this way in overt European politics. But I can assure you within Washington and in some parts of Europe and Asia, they do sense this ongoing threat. The nuclear deal was an extraordinary moment. There is no question that sanctions brought Iran to the table. When you're a policymaker, and we have the legendary Mike Singh, who will speak shortly, who has vast policy experience. When it comes to Iran, you only have a few basic options. There are many variations, but you have diplomacy, you have sanctions, you have military confrontation. But you can almost go around a room such as this and say, who believes diplomacy with Javad Zarif on Syria was a positive thing? Positive for the Syrians. Anybody think we should try that again if you can turn the clock back? Okay. Anybody think we should go to war with Iran tomorrow? Okay. So what are you left with? Because you need to stop the missiles, the terrorist attacks. You need to stop Iranians from detaining more American nationals. which is at an all-time high in their country, and you need some pressure point so that within the office of the supreme leader, you want to create a construct where the supreme leader's advisors come to him and say, is this prize worth this price? The nuclear deal sort of is, in my mind, and this is just my personal opinion, was throwing the dice on diplomacy. And you can criticize it, but diplomacy is much preferable to conflict. And it did produce some profound and important positive consequences. Iran's plutonium reactor is destroyed. That goes without saying. Iran did remove most of its highly enriched uranium, the vast majority. Iran did declare all of its overt facilities. There's no sign of any other covert facility in the country. You can't dispute that. Now, you can talk about the so-called sunset clauses, you can talk about other issues, but diplomacy gave a chance for a new door and a new beginning. You had the U.S. Conclude negotiations in The Hague on outstanding financial issues with Iran, which resulted in Iran receiving a large sum of money. You had a detainee deal with Iran. So you had some real prospects of solutions with the Iranians. But at the same time, you have Iran's regional behavior, Iran's missile program continued unabated. If you take away the nuclear program and you made a list of all the other potential malign behavior that Iran would undertake, with the exception of its nuclear program, where per approximately 13 or 14 IAEA reports, Iran continues to execute its nuclear deal obligations, albeit in a minimalist and legalistic fashion, Iran's behavior on every other issue that a US policymaker needs to care about today, its negative behavior, is off the chart. And if you're a US policymaker, you certainly need to play the long game and to think, where are we taking this relationship in 10 years? But you also need to stop the missile today. You need to find out what happened to Robert Levinson. You need to get there's a Princeton academic, completely innocent, who is detained in Iran today. You need to get him home to his family today. So your policy options need to play both that long game and today, and sanctions tend to fit into that. Diplomatic contact with Iran has been frequent and was routine in the nuclear talks. Truth in lending. I was an advisor to the nuclear deal discussions and attended every meeting from the first meeting in Muscat to the last in Vienna. I've worked for various administrations, apolitical. It's not my job to talk policy, but to rather just talk what we know about something. Iran refused to discuss the region. It refused to discuss missiles. It refused to discuss seriously detainees, period. And since then, people will say, well, the nuclear deal didn't last long enough. It didn't last long enough for Iran's behavior to change. That is, in the long game, correct, because it takes a long time for society to change. But let's take that back to the problems of today. To our dear Saudi friends in the room, you've had about 211 missiles fired by Lebanese Hezbollah, Iranian-supported Houthis from Yemen against your cities. That's over about a 2-year period. If I were to ask you to have another 5 years of that to see if Iran changes, are you in favor of this? So how long do you give Iran to make a change on actions which can kill people? Kill people. The problem with Iran is that each side, on America and Iran, are perceived to be putting forward maximalist positions. And this is also very interesting because, as I say, I'm old, and there was a time when Arabists, Mustarabin in this country would talk about, and I've mentioned some of my colleagues before, the Sheikhdom of Muhammara, the Idrisi Emirate of Asir, the Sanjak of Alexandretta. And these days, I sometimes find it difficult for people to remember what happened 3 years ago. But what Secretary Pompeo asked in May, the 12 demands, which are often described as outrageous or extensive, that was US policy until the second Obama administration. That was Europe's policy until the second Obama administration. That was not deemed as too much to ask from Iran. But if you break those demands down to 3 categories, they are Iran has no role in the region. Iran should not take detainees. Iran does not need a capacity for a nuclear weapon. That's really the three pieces of the Secretary of State's position. That was not deemed unreasonable by multiple US administrations. Europe it's something I just don't understand today. There are many Europeans who are at risk from Iranian missiles in this country. There are European detainees. The British foreign minister is in Tehran today or shortly about to talk in part about Iranian detainees. Britain understands Iran's role in Yemen, which, like Syria, has significantly contributed to extending that conflict. And although the Arab coalition is often seen as the reason for the suffering of Yemen, the extension of conflicts means civilians suffer in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. And Iran has generally escaped blame for this. Within Europe, within Iran itself, there is the conversation of what is the status of the country and how does that lead toward negotiations. I think if you're sitting in the chair of the supreme leader, it's a very fragile and dangerous time. Whereas Saudi Arabia has planned 2030, the supreme leader really has planned 1979. And that is a challenge for him because we're facing his own succession coming forward. Iran will face three important inflection points: the change of a new supreme leader, municipal elections in 2020, a new president in 2021. And if you're in Iran right now, the various players are maneuvering not only to take those positions, but how to shape their world so that these inflection points don't radically change what they believe in. Iran's ecological situation is the poorest in its modern history. Khorramshahr was never a recipient of significant investment, even under the Shah, but it's far less under the Islamic Republic. You have water, electricity, sewage problems throughout the country as mismanagement over the years has degraded infrastructure. You have a demographic issue. A large portion of Iran was born after the revolution and barely remembers the Iran-Iraq War. They don't remember what the supreme leader and his colleagues fought for. So if you're the supreme leader sitting in a chair and you are under the age of 35, your perception of what Iran is about is very different. Henry Kissinger once said Iran must decide whether to be a cause or a country or a cause. In some cases now it's neither and both. Within Iran, there is a large portion of the population which does not believe in the revolution, or at least the revolution of 1979. That doesn't mean they want to get rid of the supreme leader. That does not mean they want to get rid of even the RGC. But this is not 1980. It is more of a country on the inside, more Iran, more Persian, more nationalist. But outside of Iran, where Iran succeeds is with the cause. You have Kataib Hezbollah, Sahaba al-Haq, Sayed al-Shahada, Lebanese Hezbollah, Ansar Allah, Iran's support to Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Iranian elements within the Palestinian community in Gaza, Iran's relationships with the Taliban. This is a cause. So finally, it comes down to, can Iran negotiate? Can we expect Iran to negotiate right now with the United States? And you have to look at this at various levels. You can have citizen-to-citizen contact, not a question. This happens routinely. It has been happening for years. It matters very little on the things that produce missiles, that produce Kataib Hezbollah, but in the long term, it matters very much. It doesn't matter on detainees. You have mid-level contacts of diplomats who actually run into each other at the UN and UN in facilities, and produces nothing, and has not for years. When people say the United States and Iran have no way to talk to each other, Those people usually forget, and we have one of the giants, one of the legends of the United Nations structure here, but the United Nations provides that avenue routinely in Vienna, Geneva, and of course, New York, where Dr. Gdaia and his legendary father played such an important role of bringing peace to the world. But if you're the supreme leader, and if you're in Iran itself, negotiations for the United States, I would argue, are a very bad thing, and there are no strategic drivers for this. If you're the supreme leader, and a conversation I would have is, if you look at Saudi Arabia, which is a very different culture from the United States, and I mentioned this yesterday, I am astounded how many Starbucks you have in this country. Your Arabic coffee is so good. Who let that in? You have McDonald's here in a country with great shawarmas, and I've obviously had a few. Who let that in? But it is not seen as a threat to Saudi culture or to Saudi governance. Kentucky Fried Chicken in Iran is seen as a threat to governance. If you're the supreme leader, you need to fear Western culture because it undermines the revolutionary values. If you're a revolutionary, you need a counter-revolution, counter-revolutionary threat, and that's what the United States occupies. That's what Saudi Arabia occupies. You can't have that revolution. If you treat someone as an equal and engage them, what is the purpose of the Islamic Republic's ultimate social and political values for the people of the generation of the supreme leader if all they have is, we can talk to the imperialists and to the Wahhabis? If you're below the supreme leader's level, if you're Rouhani, Sadiq Larijani, Ali Larijani, a few other people, you'd like to be supreme leader. Who thinks it's a good idea for any of these people to raise their hand and say, I'd like to talk to the United States? If you're at the IRGC level, who do you think in the IRGC believes they should give up their successes in Syria or Yemen? You're on the Bab el-Mandab and the Saudi border a few hundred miles from Medina Munawwara. Who do you think in the IRGC or the Quds Force will say, we should give that up? So I think in the near term, the likelihood for negotiations is very thin. Europe is very unlikely to change in the near term. The Trump administration will continue with sanctions. Sanctions will not produce an immediate change in Iran, but they are an effective long-term tool of impacting behavior. Iran's internal situation will change. And I think we just have to be prepared to be agile for these changes. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Dr. Gdaia.
Thank you, Norman, for this very thought-provoking statements and very eloquent and articulate comments. And now we give the floor to Mr. Michael Singh, and we would like to welcome him to our discussion today, although via satellite. Thank you.
On why the Trump administration withdrew from the nuclear deal. I don't want to reduce American policy towards Iran to strictly a question of the nuclear deal, because obviously our concerns about Iran and your concerns about Iran go far beyond that. But obviously this is the issue which is dominating, for better or worse, American policy at the moment. I would say there were three reasons that the Trump administration withdrew from Iran. Two of them are well known, and I think one is less appreciated. The first is Republicans, and the Trump administration obviously is a Republican administration, had a number of substantive criticisms of the JCPOA. And Norm, my former colleague and my friend, went over some of those in his remarks. The second was politics. President Trump had promised his presidential campaign to withdraw, and so he sees himself as keeping that promise. and you may have noticed it follows a pattern with President Trump withdrawing from a number of different agreements that were negotiated by his predecessors. The third reason, though, I think, is that the Trump administration sensed an opportunity that wasn't compatible with continuing to remain in the JCPOA. I think there was a sense in the Trump administration that the Iranian regime was vulnerable to sanctions, particularly right now because of some of its economic and political troubles. And I think they believed that they couldn't really bring the pressure they wanted to bear on the regime while still complying with the JCPOA. So the model that they have adopted now towards Iran, having withdrawn from the JCPOA, is similar to the model they've sought to adopt towards North Korea. I won't comment here whether or not it's been successful against North Korea. That's a different discussion. But essentially, it's maximum pressure combined with a bold diplomatic opening. So when it comes to maximum pressure, we have seen the reimposition of all of the U.S. sanctions that were alleviated with the signing of the JCPOA, plus the addition of some additional U.S. sanctions even beyond that. And when it comes to the bold diplomatic opening, I think Norm addressed this point. President Trump has apparently reached out seeking to meet with President Rouhani and has made known publicly his willingness to meet with his Iranian counterparts really at any time. And I believe that, frankly, he's sincere in that. If you doubt that, all you need to do is look at his summit with Kim Jong-un to understand this is a person who's willing to take unconventional steps. The reimposition of American sanctions will have, undoubtedly it already have had, profound economic effects inside Iran. I think we can see a decline in GDP. We can see an increase in inflation, an increase in unemployment. There's been a precipitous drop in Iranian currency. None of these are, of course, the outcome that the United States is looking for. These are kind of outcomes that means to an end. What the United States hopes is that this economic pressure will produce pressure on the regime to return to negotiations with the United States. And Norm went over this point quite a bit. Whether that pressure is direct pressure, so the leadership of Iran feels it itself, or whether that pressure comes from the people of Iran because of the economic conditions there. But as I said, this is the economic pressure itself is a means to an end. The reaction of the rest of the world obviously has not been positive towards these U.S. steps. We've seen efforts by our European allies, by our Asian allies, to resist this change in U.S. policy. And I think it's fair to say that this is, as far as I can recall, and maybe some of the other panelists could think of examples I can, this is the first time we've attempted to put in place this kind of secondary sanctions regime without at least a tacit convergence of interests or tacit convergence of policy with our allies. The first time we did this with respect to Iran, I wouldn't say we had the full cooperation of our European partners, for example, but we at least saw eye to eye with them on the threat and on the strategy. We don't right now in this case. And that's why you see active European efforts to get around the American sanctions on Iran and preserve the JCPOA through measures which are largely symbolic at this stage, like the special purpose vehicle they announced. The most recent round of U.S. sanctions that were reimposed, many of you will have noted, were not reimposed as harshly as they could have been. For example, different waivers were issued to the sanctions that require states under American sanctions to reduce their oil imports from Iran. There was this sort of an application of the so-called SWIFT sanctions. These are the sanctions that impact Iran's ability to work within the international financial community. That was, again, not as harsh as it could have been. I think that this, let's say, leniency in a sense, really had sort of two audiences in mind. One was our allies in Europe especially, and it was meant to sort of perhaps heal some of the divisions between the United States and our allies on these points, and to get some buy-in from those allies to the renewed pressure campaign against Iran. To the extent it was effective in that regard, I would say it was only minimally effective, although we did see after the U.S. Sanctions were announced some cooperation from SWIFT organization itself. But I think there's also a message to Iran in that less arch implementation of sanctions that there was still plenty of room for U.S. pressure to grow and that they should accept the U.S. offer to negotiate. So where is American policy going after this? I don't think that the object of American policy towards Iran is regime change. Now, that's not to say that the United States, both Republicans and Democrats, frankly, wouldn't be perfectly happy to see the Iranian regime, the 1979 revolutionary regime, be replaced by something that is less hostile to the United States. Of course, the United States would. But I don't believe that is the object of American policy. I think that President Trump is sincere in wanting a new and quote-unquote better deal with Iran that is more comprehensive. I think there is a sense within the Trump administration that if there's going to be broad sanctions relief, also has to be a broad deal with Iran for some of the reasons that Norm was talking about. And I think they simply take a different view than the Obama administration did about how one can address these issues with Iranians. President Obama, as Norm talked about, I think believe that the nuclear deal could be a first step towards a broader rapprochement. I don't think the Trump administration holds that same view. I don't think either that the midterm election results in the United States, which if you followed them, were a victory essentially for the Democrats in the United States, will much change American policy towards Iran. The Democrats were not happy with President Trump's decision to withdraw from the JCPOA because they had thrown their support largely behind it as a party when President Obama first brought it forward in 2015. At the same time, this has been an issue, concern about Iran, that has largely been a bipartisan issue. And I think you would find support for Iran sanctions from both Republicans and Democrats. And frankly, if President Trump can manage to get the Iranians to the table and negotiate a new deal, I don't think that there would be a position from Democrats for that. I should also say as an aside, because we're talking about the future here, that should there be a Democratic president in 2020 elected in the United States, I don't think it would be so easy for that president to simply step back into the JCPOA for different reasons. And I'm happy to talk about that more if there's Q&A. What about the Iranian reaction to U.S. policy? Obviously, this is critical because American policy is designed to produce a certain reaction from Iran. That reaction that the United States wants is for Iran to return to negotiations. I think we need to look at why Iran chose to enter the JCPOA in the first place. And this is really more Norm's territory than mine, but I'll give you my view. And that is, I think, for two reasons. Iran was able to have its cake and eat it too, as we say in the United States, because it got to receive sanctions relief while also keeping its essential nuclear weapons capability and perhaps more importantly, having its nuclear program legitimized by the United States and the United Nations and really the whole world, bearing in mind that that nuclear program had been developed clandestinely and in defiance of the IAEA and its international obligation. So the JCPOA still delivers, despite the fact the U.S. has withdrawn, on part of that premise. So sanctions relief is largely gone, and I think that Iran has actually reconciled itself to that for the most part. But that legitimacy that the JCPOA gave the nuclear program is still there. And there's a new benefit to the JCPOA, I think, in Iran's eyes, and that is the wedge that has now been driven between the United States and our allies in Europe and Asia. So there is a value to Iran still in the JCPOA, which gives Iran the incentive to remain within the deal, and we've seen Iran do that in defiance of some expectations. And I think that Iran is counting on the fact that the United States is relatively isolated, that there is some bipartisan division within the United States and that President Trump has expressed very clearly his desire not to engage in any further military entanglements in the region, all as sort of signs that perhaps they can get through this period of American policy. I think we'll likely see one of two responses, therefore, from Iran. One will be just to continue to wait out the Trump administration and its policy, in hopes that something better will come along and that the U.S. sanctions ultimately will falter. And I think that there's a view, based upon past experience with sanctions, that sanctions will reach some maximum point, then will deteriorate from there as workarounds are developed. I think, again, one of the reasons the Trump administration has left itself some room in sanctions is to counter that expectation. The other possibility is that, depending on politics inside Iran and the decisions of Iranian leaders, that Iran could, in fact, choose to withdraw from the JCPOA and resume the escalation of its nuclear program, expansion of its nuclear program. The temptation to do this, I think, arises from the fact that the nuclear program is really Iran's trump card, because it knows that this is the one thing it can do that really gets the attention, not just of the United States, not just of Saudi Arabia, but of much of the world. And again, like the North Koreans, I think Iran may feel as though it can be paid simply for a return to the status quo ante. Which path it will take, I think, probably depends on how deeply sanctions impact not just the economic, but the political situation inside Iran. So what can we do to produce a better outcome? One thing that I think it's important to recognize, especially if you're sitting in Riyadh, is that even though the Trump administration has withdrawn from the JCPOA, what hasn't changed, as far as I can tell, in the United States, from where I sit, is the desire to essentially get out of the Middle East as much as we can. This is something that President Obama clearly felt, especially in his second term, but that President Trump has talked about as well. And I think that as long as that's the American desire, it gives an advantage to Iran, and it puts a special burden on our allies to think about how they would balance Iran in the absence of that American commitment to the region. Now, I happen to think that we should be committed to the region because it's in our interest to do so. And that's an argument that many of us mount here in the United States. It's an argument that Norton has made as well. And for that reason, I think that we shouldn't think of necessarily a deal as the endpoint of American policy with Iran. I think oftentimes those who want to deal with Iran, whether it's a comprehensive deal or simply a nuclear deal, want it because they feel as though it could be a first step in some kind of American exit of the region. I think we should think of instead deterrence of Iran. It's really the object of our policy, and a policy that doesn't necessarily have a clear end. We're dealing with countries like Iran. Russia's another example. China's an example. They're all very different. I'm not meaning to lump them all together as the same. We have to be careful not to think of endpoints. These are ongoing challenges, and I see Iran as an ongoing challenge as well. I think if we're going to meet that challenge, there's a few things the United States will need to do, and I think that those countries which are standing with us, like Saudi Arabia and some other partners in the region, are going to need to think about how to do these things as well. First is to bring allies on board in Europe and in Asia, because I think that, again, Iran sees that wedge that has been driven between the United States and our allies outside the region as a strategic advantage for them, and we should try to deny that strategic advantage. Second, I think it'll be important for the Trump administration to gain more bipartisan support for policy here in Washington to deflate or defeat the Iranian expectation that a new administration in 2020 could bring a very different policy towards Iran. Third, I think we'll need a comprehensive policy towards Iran, and not just a policy of sanctions. Dr. Keynoush, our first speaker, went into this point about how sanctions are not a policy, and I agree entirely. Sanctions are not going to get Iran to land in Syria or in Iraq or in Yemen or elsewhere. We'll need to be willing to use the full spectrum of American policy tools and allies' policy tools to push back Iran in these places. That will require realistic objectives. I don't think personally that we're going to get, for example, every Iranian out of Syria in the way that some policymakers have spoken about. And I know what they mean when they say that. They mean that they don't think that Iran should be dictating outcomes in Syria, I think. But we need to be realistic about exactly what our red lines are, exactly what we want to stop Iran from doing. But I think that pushback, excuse me, is only one part of that kind of comprehensive policy. Another part has to be strengthening our allies in the region and strengthening the bonds between our allies in the region. I think that there's no doubt that in the United States, and probably this goes for much of the West in general, we would like to see our regional allies step up and address regional issues themselves rather than have the United States intervene. And I think that view is probably shared in the region as well. Unfortunately, that can't be achieved by the United States simply exiting. It has to be achieved by, I think, partnership in which the United States helps our allies to build up their strength capabilities. We also need to deny Iran opportunities to meddle. If you look at the places Iran is most active, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Iran, for the most part, is taking advantage of already destabilized situations to increase its influence and project its power. And so as much as we focus on those places where there's already conflict, it's, I think, just as important to focus on other allies in the region who may be vulnerable, who may be fragile, and ensure that there aren't new situations which Iran can turn to its advantage. I do think as well that we will need a willingness to engage with Iran, but not to engage with Iran as a substitute for pressure, but to use engagement and coercion in concert, because I think that usually is a formula that is most likely to produce results. I tend to agree with Norm. I think that American officials right now are ready to engage, and it's the Iranians who are hesitant for reasons which I've already talked about. I think it's important the United States remain open to engagement, not just at the top level, but frankly at all levels, because I think that even if it doesn't produce a grand bargain, which I think is a distant prospect anyway, there can be value for the United States and for our allies in doing that. All of this, as I said, assumes an American commitment to the region, which I think is absolutely essential, and that many of us here in Washington continue to argue for. Obviously, without that commitment to the region, you have a very different situation, both for our allies and for Iran. I'm going to stop there, and thanks so much.
Now we got to extend the time.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like in the beginning to thank Dr. Muhammad Al-Salami and Rasanah for giving us this opportunity to share our opinions and interactions. This session will discuss the reflection of U.S.-Iran relations on the Gulf states. We have two well-known speakers, Dr. Abdulaziz Al-Uwaishig and Dr. Mansour Al-Marzouqi. I would like to introduce in the beginning Dr. Abdulaziz Al-Uwaishig. He is GCC Assistant, GCC Gulf Cooperation Council, Assistant Secretary General for Political and Negotiation Affairs. In this capacity, he is responsible for coordination of GCC foreign policy towards regional and international issues, as well as managing GCC relations with the rest of the world. He is also responsible for the GCC trade negotiations, strategic partnership, and dialogue with other countries and blocs. Before assuming the post of Assistant Secretary General in 2011, he served as GCC Director General for International Economic Relations between 2009 and 2011, and Director of Economic Integration, where he worked for 10 years, since 1999 to 2008, overseeing the GCC economic integration process. Between 2002 and 2011, he was also responsible for the establishment of the GCC Common Market, which was launched in December 2007. Before joining the GCC in 1999, Dr. Abdulaziz served as an economist and legal expert at the United Nations in New York. In Saudi Arabia, he worked in a number of government departments. He was also served on several high-level national commissions for manpower strategies, unemployment, education reform, and strategic cooperation. The academic career of Dr. Lweshig, he studied law at Columbia University in New York, economics at New York University, and political economy at the New University for Social Research, and all of them in New York City. He studied art of negotiation at Harvard Negotiation Institute. Dr. Abdulaziz taught in a number of US and GCC universities. He has written extensively on economic, political, and legal issues in the GCC, Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, and the region at large. His weekly column on current economic and international affairs appears every Monday in Arab News, which is Saudi publication, and every Tuesday in Arabic in Al-Watan, Saudi Arabia. He also writes a monthly column in the Dubai-based Gulf News. Welcome, Dr. Abdulaziz, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Just a small correction. I think my column in Arab News is every Tuesday now. So, otherwise, everything was accurate. Thank you very much. And I really apologize for not being here because I meant to be here. But the president of Iraq is visiting Saudi Arabia, and we went to meet with him. And as usual, these meetings take longer than you expect, waiting. But we also talked about Iran, and I will start with that. We talked with the President Barham Saleh about Iran. Of course, the president of Iraq usually is a ceremonial post, but I think during times of crises, the role of the president is crucial in forming the government and in mediating between the various branches of government. And besides, Barham Saleh, as probably many of you know, was a long-time activist. Actually, I met him the first time in the 1990s in New York when he was advocating on behalf of Kurdish autonomy. And eventually he succeeded in persuading the United States to support that. He is independent within Kurdistan. He's not part of either major party. So I think this is the first time we see somebody from outside the two rival parties in charge of this post or any important post in Iraq. We talked mainly about the relationship that what we hope for is the relationship between Iraq and countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Last year in December, the heads of state of the GCC instructed the Secretariat to put together an action plan to engage with Iraq. That action plan have already been approved by the Iraqi Council of Ministers and by all of our membership. And we were waiting for this time after the formation of the government, after the elections in Iraq, to start engaging with Iraq. So probably in the very near future, we will visit Iraq and start engaging with Iraq. Many issues to discuss. The main one for us is that for Iraq to become independent again, to run its own territory, to prevent terrorist groups and countries like Iran from using its territory as a springboard to attack its neighbors, either directly or indirectly. Now, I'll get to my subject, which is really this subject is how to deal with Iran's declared policies of exporting its revolution and spreading its hegemony through the use of sectarian divisions in the country and in the countries surrounding it, and if they didn't exist, how to actually create them. I think it has been said many times, and I think it's true to some degree, that the GCC was established in 1981 in part in response to that challenge. The revolution of the Iranian Revolution in February 1979 set in motion an earthquake in the region that destabilized it. We're talking now about 79. And for a while, there was some hope that Iran was going to moderate its position, was going to stop trying to export its revolution. And I'll come to this now in some detail. But then again, in 2011, at the time of the Arab Spring, Iran saw a new opportunity for it to spread its revolution and again to establish hegemony over its neighbors. And I think this time it has succeeded. And it's our job all now on how to deal with that, how to reverse it. The Gulf Cooperation Council took two main tracks to deal with Iran. One is the diplomatic and political, and one is building our own defenses to deal with all the threats that emanated from Iran after the revolution. And I'll talk about the political first, and then I'll talk about how the GCC is building up its defenses to meet various threats that are coming out of Iran. Politically, in 1986, the GCC, I think the first time, proposed to Iran 10 different principles. Almost all of them were taken from the UN Charter and from international law. Called on Iran, suggested to Iran that we engage in dialogue. At the time, the United Arab Emirates was asked to be the conduit of these messages, and they met with Iran several times. It didn't succeed, partly because Iran at the time was focused on the Iraqi threat, on ending the war with Iraq, and they were in no mood for reconciliation or for dialogue. So that didn't work very much. The second attempt was during the time of President Rafsanjani, who started, I think, in 1989, and was president for 8 years. There was some success at the time. The main interlocutor, the main GCC interlocutor was Saudi Arabia, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And it succeeded in achieving some confidence-building measures. Some agreements were signed, and I think there was some lowering of tensions at the time. And that continued also during Khatami, some extent, but then that didn't last also. It did not lead to a meaningful agreement between the GCC and Iran to change the behavior, to change the orientation of the Iranian government, which still remained committed to the idea of exporting the revolution. In other words, Iran, at least parts of it that were run directly by the supreme leader, and with it the Revolutionary Guards. The Revolutionary Guards, as you know, gained a lot of prominence after the Iraqi war and became really the real arbiters of power in Iraq. And so with the renewed power, with the paranoia about Iraq, and if you talk to Iranians today, Iranian officials and intellectuals, thinkers, they all are stuck in that period. That we were attacked by Iraq, and everybody now has to pay the price. And this is our chance to make them do that. They really still think that, even senior politicians like Zarif and others, they still are stuck in that period. So we still didn't give up. So we tried again in 2007. This time Qatar, the state of Qatar, invited Ahmadinejad, the president, to take part in the GCC summit in December 2007. That was followed by about a year and a half of intense negotiations that covered everything except the issues that we wanted to talk about. They were talking about trade, talking about movement of people, talking about everything. but Iran, would not agree to put the issues that concern us the most on the table. And I remember the sitting with President Ahmadinejad in one of the provincial towns, and I think it was probably the third or fourth meeting we had with him. And so we tried one more time to discuss the sectarian issue, meaning Iran's encouragement of sectarian divisions within our countries, its insistence on interference in our affairs, and exporting the revolution. And he said this is just Western propaganda. There is no truth to it, nothing to discuss here. And therefore Iran cannot put this on the agenda. This is after discussion with Muttaqi and other officials. We continued to try to do that for a few months after that, but again that didn't work. The last attempt, which is the current one, is still ongoing, is in 2016. The GCC heads of state responded to a letter from Iran that said they would like to open a new page. So this time we asked Iran, learning from the previous failed attempts, we said this time we want to make it easier for Iran to accept the dialogue. And we said we would like to propose that both Iran and we commit to certain principles. One of them is to say publicly and openly that we respect the UN Charter. Now that should not be controversial, which entails respect for political independence, territorial integrity, and respect for the political systems that each country has chosen. Non-interference, not to use force or threat to use force. All of these things are in the Charter. And of course, international law principles which govern the relations between neighbors. So that's one. Two, that we agree that we will not try to undermine each other's political systems by the use of sectarian means. In particular, we wanted a public statement that Iran, and of course we, will not demand from from the citizens of other countries who happen to be Shia or Sunni to have loyalty outside their national government. And we worded it in a very diplomatic language that everybody can accept. Iran responded, but without committing to that. They responded, they said, we welcome that, but without really making a strong commitment to that. And we're still hoping that through the mediation of Kuwait, that there will be some change in the thinking of Iran. Of course, it has to be both in words and deeds. I mean, there is no point in agreeing to all these principles of the UN Charter and international law and then continuing to break the UN Charter every day. So it has to be a commitment in both words and deeds, and has to be public, because we believe, as many people believe, that Iran has two faces, one Dr. Jekyll and one Mr. Hyde, and so that we want both sides to hear the same message. We want the Revolutionary Guards to hear the same message from the highest authority in Iran, that yes, Iran now is going to be from now on a normal country, living within its own borders, and will pose no threat to its neighbors. And it seems that's politically difficult for any Iranian leader to do it at this time. So as we wait for Iran to decide its own, to put its house in order, to agree to abandon the revolution and act like a normal state, the GCC has been building its own defenses. And we have in the GCC strategy as taking many formulations. The last one was endorsed by heads of states in April 2017, the last formulation, after it was agreed by the ministers of Interior, Defense, and Foreign Affairs in a joint meeting in Riyadh in 2017. The parts of it that are most important and can be discussed here are as follows. First, we identify the main threats that come from Iran. Second part talks about how to deal with those different threats in concrete, practical actions. And in the third part is the political part, which is how do we translate any agreement into practical steps that can defuse the situation and deal with those threats through a political process. But we have reached the conclusion a long time ago that there will not be a meaningful agreement from Iran towards making peace with its neighbors unless it's convinced that it can no longer gain from using force or using their proxies or using sectarian strife, sectarian divisions. They will not abandon those methods unless they feel that they can no longer use them. So they need to be neutralized. And how do we do that? So first, our experts, as I said, this is a joint effort, an all government effort within each country, involving the ministries I mentioned, but also involving other agencies that deal with this, including intelligence and others. So the first and most obvious threat is the military threat. And that can be divided into conventional military. That can be divided into three main parts. The nuclear threat, the military nuclear threat, the ballistic missile program, and the conventional military or traditional military threats. For the nuclear program, it's no secret that the GCC from the beginning, before it was signed and after it was signed and until now, thinks that it has serious shortcomings. Two main ones, but others as well, but two main shortcomings. One, the sunset clause, meaning at some point it's going to expire. And the second point is the inspections. We do not believe that the inspection regime in the nuclear deal, as it was signed, prevents Iran from breaking away into making nuclear weapons. And that has to be strengthened. All sides, there are many details here, but I just want to catalog these threats. And the second one is the ballistic missile program. We do not believe that the regime that is agreed in United Nations Security Council Resolution 2231 is enough, especially after we had discussions with the P5 and we found out that a country like Russia, which claims that they have drafted the resolution, Russia believes that that 2231 does not preclude Iran from doing the developments it's doing now for its ballistic missile program. They believe that Iran is consistent with 2231. And of course, Iran, since the deal, has accelerated its ballistic missile program. There was a slowdown during the negotiations, but once it was signed, they accelerated the program. They accelerated the range and other things. And almost all of them, I'm no expert in nuclear warfare, but it seems to me that almost all the recent missiles are capable of carrying nuclear heads. And that's the criterion mentioned in 2231. But the Russians believe that's not, they're not. So we need to strengthen that regime. The third element of the military. So I'll just mention very quickly then the rest, and if there is interest, I can expand on it. The third is the military, the conventional military threat, and that's something that the GCC countries have worked on from the beginning of the GCC. And I think in some areas, especially Air Force, we're more than a match for Iran. But I think in other areas, work's still ongoing. One element of strength that the GCC has is ability to build a coalition of forces from all the GCC countries, plus, of course, our allies, and mainly the United States. You probably heard the news about 3 weeks ago that for the first time, a commander of GCC forces, all of them have been appointed. General Shiloui from Saudi Arabia, his deputy from the UAE had already been appointed. The new joint command will oversee all of the services, land, air, and maritime forces. And so it's a step in the right direction, a step towards, I think, making GCC ability to withstand Iranian conventional military threats, to neutralize them. Okay, so this is the military threat. The second one, which is probably the most difficult, is the non-conventional threats from Iran. What is called sometimes asymmetric threats, and they include two main ones. One is terrorism, and Iran has become a center of excellence for putting together effective, incredibly effective terrorist groups. Probably the largest one is Hezbollah, but there are at least a dozen other equally lethal groups that are in Syria, Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan, everywhere. And the second asymmetric threat from Iran is the use of the sectarian card. You have countries like Syria, Iraq that never really knew, or Saudi Arabia or others, never knew sectarian strife. There were sectarian divisions throughout history, but there was no strife, no fighting, no war between these sects. Iran managed very skillfully to weaponize those sectarian differences. So that's the second, again, asymmetric threat. The third one is the territorial threat from Iran. Iran occupies some territory, some GCC territory, principally the 3 islands from UAE, but also they make regular incursions into GCC territory, especially on the continental shelf and the maritime economic zones. They infringe on our member states' mineral rights in the Gulf. So that's another major threat that also we need to deal with. So far I'm just cataloging them, and then the last one, but the last one I'm going to talk about is the environmental threat. As Iran develops its nuclear facilities, now they have one active nuclear reactor in Bushehr, and they have placed some of them, since they've placed them on the fault line, the earthquake fault line in Iran. We had a couple of close calls actually over the last couple of years. The GCC has recognized this as a major threat, and we are building our capacity to deal with it. We hope it doesn't happen, but in case there is a nuclear accident, we're building capacity to deal with it. So I think you told me this is out of time, so I'll stop here, but there are other issues. I want to conclude with one thing. So as I mentioned earlier, these things have been in development for a long time, and they span several US administrations. And we had agreements and sometimes differences of opinion with the United States over some of those elements, even about approaches to Iran. But they're all within the context that we are dealing with our closest strategic ally, which is the United States, regardless of some differences of opinion every now and then. So sometimes I think things are exaggerated about differences of opinion with the Obama administration. But in fact, those discussions continued. And all the major elements, whether it's building a ballistic missile defense shield, or it is building our conventional military, or dealing with counterterrorism, continued throughout. Sometimes the pace changes. Sometimes the US administration was not happy with some of the dialogue that we had with Iran in the past. And now probably, with this administration, this is the closest administration to the viewpoint of the GCC. We were very happy about the new pronouncements by this government, but this is an American policy. It's just, as I said, the emphasis sometimes changes, but it's consistent. And we were happy with the cooperation with the United States. Almost all the elements I mentioned are subjects for work with the United States throughout the framework of the what we call the strategic partnership. There are about 10 working groups deal with each issue, each important issue, including ballistic missile defense, but also economics and others, sanctions, counterterrorism. So we work with our allies. So the number one, as I mentioned, is the United States, and then with the United Kingdom as well, with almost all the P5. We have differences of opinions with some of them, especially Russia. We have some difference of opinion with China of the P5. But I think in general, we try to work with all of them. None of them is happy, by the way, with Iran's behavior. A very senior Russian official told us one time, he said, Iranians make it difficult for us to remain friends with them. You know? So nobody's happy with them, but they're pursuing their interests as I see them. I would say short-term interests, enabling Iran sometimes. And of course, we're not happy with that. We think that this is short-term, and we think it emboldens Iran. It encourages the bad elements in Iran to continue their aggressive policies. So I'll stop here. I don't want to go on beyond that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abdulaziz, about your rich information and the current situation of GCC. I would like to introduce the second speaker, who is Dr. Mansour Al-Marzouqi. He is an assistant professor of political science at Prince Saud Al Faisal Institute for Diplomatic Studies in Riyadh. Dr. Mansour is the director of the Center for Strategic Studies at the Institute. The education life of Dr. Mansour is he has 2 bachelor degrees in English literature plus a bachelor degree in political science, and both are from Oregon State University, USA. And he has also a master degree in comparative politics from Sciences Po, Paris, France, and a PhD in political sociology from Sciences Po de Lyon, France. Dr. Mansour published many articles and books about political international relations, and also he's a poet and a writer as well. Welcome, Dr. Mansour, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Just a small note, I did not give him this presentation. Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. Some of the faces are familiar, others are not, and I'm happy to get familiar with. I will, in my presentation, argue for the following in the context of the transformation of world order. If relations between the US and Iran get better, improve, the probability of normalizing Iranian expansionism on the one hand and Iranian revisionism on the other hand will increase. The prospects of the West in general and the US in particular normalizing expansionism and revisionism in my view, will increase. If, on the other hand, if the relations between Washington and Tehran deteriorate, the risk of Iran intensifying, on the one hand, expansionism, on the other hand, revisionism, in my opinion, will increase, and therefore putting the GCC, and in particular Saudi Arabia, at a greater risk. One, in confronting these 2 types of challenges. 2, in being more exposed to our strategic allies, namely the US and Europe, being at a greater risk of transactionalism, meaning that we will have to make deals on a cyclical rhythm with our Western allies, Washington to begin with. So one possible way of dealing with this is that the Arabian Gulf states, GCC states, has for long claimed to be a status quo power in the region when it comes to the regional order. That status quo-ness, if I may make a word, following the lead of Banafsheh, that status quo-ness has to be updated. We need a 2.0 version of that status quo, namely redefining alliances within the GCC, redefining the structural approach to GCC security within the GCC countries. And the second thing that we will need is not only try to confront and push back against Iranian expansionism and revisionism, but also safeguard GCC states against Western transactionalism in general. So this is briefly the argument. The rest of my presentation will be dedicated to presenting what I mean by Iranian expansionism, what I mean by Iranian revisionism, and finally, what I mean by transformations in the world order. First, Iranian expansionism. Iranian strategic depth, in my view, is partially built on incrementalist alliances with violent non-state actors in the region, namely in the Arab world. Those alliances are based on two things. One, a sectarian ideology as a basis for constructing the alliance, and two, breaking states' monopoly over violence. In the classical literature of political science, one of the defining characters of a state is that it enjoys an exclusive access to legitimate violence, a monopoly over the use of violence. One major defining character of non-state actors allied with Iran is that they break states' monopoly over the use of violence. An example in Lebanon, it's not the central government that has a monopoly over the use of violence, but rather the militia of Hezbollah. When the state installs cameras and apparatus of surveillance at the airport, Hezbollah intervenes with guns and forces the Lebanese army, a state institution, to back off. So the monopoly over violence, which is an extremely important element of the picture, is broken. So being built on a sectarian ideology and on breaking states' monopoly over violence. Moreover, militias cannot be operational and effective unless the central government doesn't have the said monopoly over violence, and they cannot polarize and recruit new members in these militias unless sectarianism is dominant. And therefore, I will argue that the dominance of sectarianism is a prerequisite for an environment conducive to Iranian expansionism. This, which poses a paradox, leads to the weakness of the state, leads to a vacuum that could be filled from a different kind of sectarianism, a different kind of jihadism. Strategically speaking, militias fulfill two functions for Iran. One, be a frozen conflict, and two, be a disactivational actor. The frozen conflict approach is about mobilizing these incrementalist alliances as a striking force against enemies whenever it suits Iran. The disactivational approach is meant to overcome isolation of Iran. After 5 years in Lebanon, to use this example again, after 5 years of having the post of president vacant, actors in the region needed to sit at the table with Iran in order to elect or choose a president. Isolation of Iran cannot be effective when you have this activational approach. It is meant, therefore, to overcome isolation. By vetoing any political settlement regarding the election of a president, regional actors seek an arrangement with the isolated Iran, which in practice breaks its isolation. In exchange, Tehran gets something in return, which helps advance its regional agenda. These incrementalist alliances require Iran to break into Arab states one after another. Second is Iranian revisionism. Tehran persistently attempts to normalize those militias in order for them to become a natural component of regional political reality. That is one strategic aim of Iran. However, the regional order does not include militias as part of its structure or rules of conduct. Hence, restructuring the regional order in order to normalize those militias becomes an Iranian necessity, and such is Iranian revisionism. Transformations in world order and Western transactionalism, which is the second part of my presentation. The international system is transitioning from an order of unipolarity, where the US is dominant, into non-polarity. It's not multipolarity, but rather non-polarity. In a multipolar world, there is no single dominant power. Otherwise, we would be in a unipolar world. Strategic postures of states are not centered around two main positions. Otherwise, we would be in a bipolar order. The multipolar world consists of centers of power, of influence, the powerful ones colluding on a set of rules and a set of penalties for those who do not respect these rules. The powerful centers cooperate among themselves when there is a balance of power, and they slip into conflict when that balance of power is no more, is broken. A non-polar world is different in several ways. First, there is a separation between power and influence. Power, for example, during the Cold War, whether military, economic, or media, was directly linked to influence. Having a powerful media, a powerful economy, a powerful army translates directly into influence. For a state actor to have more influence, it needed to go after those conventional definitions of power. However, non-state actors challenge the monopoly over state actors over power. A big chunk of power on the world stage nowadays is actually under the control of non-state actors, not only the nation states, the state actors. And this is a strategic structural shift in world system. Second, globalization. Globalization enhanced a vibrant zone of exchange that lies outside of the control, outside the control of states. And that is more exposed to the influence of non-state actors. That is a second aspect in which the world system is transforming. Third, in a non-polar world, there isn't a dominant power or a power hierarchy. And it will be very difficult to determine the nature of relations between players and to characterize them by simply stating that they are allies or enemies. Rather, relations will be selective, situational, and transactional. And this complicates the identification of the nature of transactions in world system. Hence, non-polarity is prone to chaos and aggressiveness. In this context of the transformations in world system, it seems to me that the cost for deterring Iranian expansionism and Iranian revisionism for the Gulf is becoming greater. And the risk of being exposed to blackmailing or asking for more in exchange for help on the part of our Western allies is becoming more real. Thank you very much.